to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism's Global Journalism seminar series. Really delighted to have such a range of people here. Just looking at the screen, I can see people from Italy, from India, from Hong Kong. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to have with us today Izin Akhabau, who is the new online editor for The Voice, Britain's definitive and oldest, I think, Afro-Caribbean newspaper. It was founded in 1982 to give a voice to the Afro-Caribbean community, to cover the issues that concern them, but also to kind of have a different voice in politics and in the news media, something that seems more pertinent than ever today. I asked Izin to come for several reasons, partly because The Voice is, as I said, one of the most pioneering publications of its time. She's also long been in her youth, well, I say long been, but she's incredibly young, but she's been for a very clear voice for what it means to be Black in Britain today, what it means to be a Black journalist in the media. She was also a kind of very clear voice for youth in an age where journalism and legacy media houses are struggling to reach younger audiences on television and in print and online. Voices like Izin's are incredibly helpful. She was the youngest journalist ever to report on the BBC's News at 10 when she was only 20 years old. And it's quite striking that you've left something like the BBC to go to The Voice. I think it's a really interesting and really brilliant career move. So I want to ask you about that as well. I'll hand it over to you though first to give your talk, and then I'll open the floor up to questions. Thank you and welcome, Izin.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just gonna get my slides on board and share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. As I was so nicely introduced, my name is Izin, and I hope that everyone is well today. We've heard the word unprecedented far too many times, but they really are unprecedented times. And I'd like to thank everyone at the Institute for the invite. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited to speak with all of you today, because I think that's one of the reasons I became a journalist. I just really enjoy speaking to people and getting to know people from different walks of life. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of my talk, I'd like to give you all a bit of a roadmap of where we're going. I think especially with Zoom presentations, that's important, because I think we are getting to a stage of Zoom fatigue. So the first bit I'm going to do is talk a bit about me and a bit about myself, and a bit about my career so far. And I think that's something that we're really great at celebrating in our industry, individual achievements, although it's something that is sometimes done to our detriment. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to speak about why young journalists' voices are important in our newsrooms. For the third part of my talk, I'm going to go into some of the detail of how I think we can get the best out of our young journalists, and also how we don't get the best out of young journalists. So I think there's a bit of a funny story, so keep going for that. And then for the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about the importance of cultivating relationships in newsrooms and in the media, specifically with a focus, I guess, on relationships between older and younger journalists. But I think that a lot of it is transferable for a lot of the tensions we are experiencing in the media landscape today. So that is a bit of my roadmap. So about me, I'm in my 20s, which is still fairly young, though it's not quite as young as I was when I first decided I wanted to embark on a media career, or when I was first commissioned to write. I decided I wanted to become a journalist who told the stories that were not usually told after a trip I took to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I worked with a charity called Novi Most, that helped Romani Gypsy communities in the country. And I went at a really pivotal time for me in my life, when I had just finished my first set of serious exams. And I met a girl called Maya, who you can see in the picture there, who had also finished her first set of exams. And the funding that the charity provided is what made that possible. But that funding was cut. And I was kind of struck by how I knew it was so important, but not many people knew about it. And so that's what gave me the journalism bug. But that experience was also important because it taught me something very important about privilege. I think that something is missing from the way we discuss privilege in our society and in our cultural context today, because privilege is only seen as an excess as having things that others don't have. However, we don't speak enough about how privilege can make us blinkered, can make us unable to recognize, can make us ignorant of whole swathes of experiences and people's lives. If it wasn't, for example, for conversations with other journalists and other people, I might say that privilege can make us blind, but that would be ableist language. So I think journalists from all walks of life who continue to educate me. After that experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was lucky enough to meet someone else who was passionate about telling the stories we are not usually told. Her name is Toby Oradine, and she started an online magazine called Black Ballad, which caters to Black and mixed race British women. She has joked to me before that she started that online magazine because she struggled to find a journalism job, and after applying several times she just thought, well, if I make this whole website, this whole media organization myself, then I can show it to all of these other media editors and hirers, and they will see my potential and they can see that actually it's worth employing me. So that is a reason to have young journalists in your newsroom. If you don't, they will start media organizations that challenge yours. And I think I'm only half joking when I say that. But I had a really great experience at Black Ballad. It was where I first became interested in investigating things in depth for particular audiences. So I looked at Black women's experiences of the criminal justice system in Britain and Black women's experiences in the immigration system. And I think because it was a smaller organization, I got to do a whole range and breadth and depth of things. I feel like every time I try to change the slide, the computer, there we go. So after working there, I was selected as one of the BBC's first digital journalism apprentices. There were only 10 of us on that scheme, but it has grown a lot since. Here I got a real breadth of media experience and of different outlets. I think that's one of the great things about working at the BBC. So I spent time working on Newsnight. I spent time working on Radio 4's The World at One. I spent some time with digital video and BBC Politics Live, and digital video would really come to be my BBC freelance home. It was during my apprenticeship that I learned something very important that I will also return to in the talk. There was a tendency of some of my colleagues and the younger journalists to kind of be quite dismissive of other journalists who were getting to grips with digital media, social media, and technology. And there was also a tendency of some of the more established traditional journalists to see trainees as an inconvenience and a burden. On both sides in this case, there was an inability of the other to see how the strengths of the other could contribute to a stronger whole and ultimately better output if the relationship was properly nurtured. Anyway, I completed my journalism exams, but I decided to go on to further study. Back then, I don't think I had all the language that I have now to articulate how the media environment was at times a very alienating place for me to exist in. But I went freelance and I did get to do some incredible things. As was so graciously mentioned, I did become the youngest person to report on the BBC's 10 o'clock news. I presented some viral video for BBC Three, and I also wrote for places like the Metro and the Independent and the iPaper. And now that brings me right full circle to where I am in my career currently. I'm online editor at The Voice newspaper, which is Britain's only Black national newspaper. And tomorrow I will have been here for 10 weeks. So that's the first part of my talk done. There. And that brings me on to the next part, which is why young journalists are important. Why should you have young journalists in your newsroom? Now, I am a big fan of social media, and there's a trend on there which is wrong answers only. So if only just to amuse myself, I'm going to start with that part. Why, what are the wrong answers to why you might decide to hire young journalists in your newsroom? You don't have to pay them. Some people want journalists and fully qualified journalists, but instead they will hire young people in the hopes that they can pay them nothing at all or very little. I'm sure that I'm speaking to a very learned group of people, and I don't need to tell you how that perpetuates a very classist media, and a media where we don't get a diverse group of people working in it. Another wrong answer for why you might choose to hire a young journalist is you have recently been challenged on the lack of diversity in your newsrooms. This is slightly unrelated and it's on a tangent, but during the height of the Black Lives Matter thing, there were a lot of frantic Zoom calls, as I'm sure there were at a range of organizations. And I remember a colleague of mine who I really like and who has always been very lovely to me, saying like, now I think of it, this team is incredibly white, it's incredibly white. And that just made me laugh so much because that was the first time that they'd realized it or come to grips with it. But I think there was a realization like that from a lot of media organizations. And I think it's what leads to schemes like the one that I was on and the scheme on which I joined the BBC, which I am immensely, immensely thankful for. And I'm always behind initiatives of that type, but I do think we need to think critically about them and the way that they sometimes almost become a smokescreen for an organization's inability to retain diverse colleagues who join their organizations. Are there diverse staff in your newsrooms at the moment? And are they valued? I think I spoke to people who had been in the media organization, been in the media industry for a long time in different organizations, who spoke of a frustration that some of the challenges and difficulties I faced were some of the challenges and difficulties that they faced. It is all well and good to get a diverse range of young trainees, but if you're inviting them into a place that is not conducive to their flourishing and where their talents can't be recognized and appreciated, then you're bringing them in at really a very vulnerable part of their lives. And so that's something I think people should think more critically about. Another reason, although I don't think it's as much the case anymore, is that some people think young journalists have social media magic on our fingertips that we will sprinkle around your newsrooms like gold dust. And while that is the case for some young journalists, it's not the case for all of them. And there are journalists from all walks of life at all ages who have a really good competence and understanding of social media, digital media, and online journalism. So those are all of the wrong reasons that you might choose to hire some young journalists, but what are some of the right reasons that you might decide to hire young journalists? I exist at a lot of intersections as a journalist, and many of us will tell you that it is difficult to exist in an industry that continuously perpetuates one way of seeing the world. And those that won't tell you that are afraid of telling you the truth. But what I will say, and it's something I alluded to a bit earlier briefly, is that existing on the margins is also a blessing in perspective. When you see how others can be so unknowingly unaware, it can give you the gift of self-reflection. So I believe in the importance of having young journalists in your newsrooms for the same reasons I believe in having Black journalists, working class journalists, women journalists, queer journalists, disabled journalists, neurodiverse journalists, and journalists at every other intersection. There is the world that we all exist in before we enter your newsrooms, and then we enter your newsrooms and we have to learn to exist there too. And so immediately we are aware that there is not just one way of seeing the world. This constant feeling that I myself don't have the full story has led me to many stories that I'm proud of, such as what life is like for disabled clubbers, how the first woman to run for US president was in fact Black, the deadly trade around the world's most expensive fish, there really is a deadly trade around the world's most expensive fish, or how deportation officers during the COVID pandemic have started working for charities because there have been less deportation flights. That lack of privilege or different perspective also means I see things that are universally accepted in our newsrooms as normal or acceptable, and I question them, and I see some of the more problematic aspects of them. Defamation law, for example, means that we question printing what someone less rich or less powerful has to say about someone who is richer or more powerful. And so how are the more privileged protected by media to the detriment of the less privileged? Who is repeatedly forced to fulfill the burden of proof or prove that they have the right to exist or that their existence is not something that should be questioned? I am also sensitive to the way that impartiality is presented as a standard that is equally fair for everyone or protects everyone. I personally feel that I have witnessed how it is weaponized against high-profile women of color journalists on several occasions. But let me go briefly back to young journalists. You can see the benefit of their perspective in the way some of the most exciting young journalists today approach storytelling. I think, for example, of the incredible and award-winning Nadine White, who uses Twitter in a way that pushes her journalism further, or Sophia Smith Geller and how she uses TikTok. And I've been told that she is also giving one of these talks, so that is great. There is also something to be said for the way a fresh pair of eyes can see things differently or bring new energy to initiatives that everyone wants to implement or bring in, but they just are having some difficulties getting it off the ground or starting. And that brings me around halfway through to my talk. I'm just checking how okay I am for time. And I'm going to talk about some of my experiences in the newsroom to talk about how we can get the best out of young journalists and how we don't get the best out of young journalists. So yes, do not ask us to twerk. I can distinctly remember my first office Christmas party. I was kind of nervous about going because I was fairly new to the team, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to go, but there were wonderful colleagues who said, no, come along, it'll be great, it'll be fun. And for the most part, I really did have a good time, except at the point where an older, white and very respected journalist and broadcaster asked me to twerk or challenged me to twerk. And I just kind of like looked at the other journalist of color in the room and said nothing. But how do we deal with these characters that we know are inappropriate that exist in our media environments? Young adults are one thing and they are vulnerable, but safeguarding is especially and particularly important for journalists under the age of 18 if you're thinking of apprenticeships. I am a big believer in something called the Pygmalion Effect. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm sure some of you will understand it far better than I do. But in essence, the Pygmalion Effect, as I understand it, means that if you have high expectations of people, they will meet those expectations. And if you have low expectations of people, they will underachieve, underperform, and underdeliver. I don't think that our newsrooms are insulated from stereotypes that permeate wider society about certain groups of people and what they are able to achieve. I've had senior colleagues insinuate that I was incapable of doing things that I was very, very capable of doing. I've also had colleagues who have seen potential in my unconventional. So for example, quite early on in my career, I spent time subbing and coordinating video from bureaus around the world for our planning desk. In both cases, I did what was expected of me. And in the first case, it was assumed that I could do far less than I could reasonably do. And in the other case, it was assumed that I could do far more. That's really important. And I think that's something that you should keep in mind when you consider the type of tasks that you are setting young journalists in your newsroom. If you see potential in a young journalist, then put support in place and be prepared to be surprised in a good way. But on the flip side, I think we must also be prepared for things not working out, because that is the nature of life. At times, things do not work out. And it's important that we don't see that as an indictment of competency, character, or ability. I think it's important here that we consider the way certain journalists get the benefit of the doubt and the ability to move on fairly scot-free after messing up, and how race and class can influence this. Now, especially in the case of inexperienced and younger journalists, they are probably coming into an environment where you are all used to functioning and working and operating like a well-oiled machine, and this can be quite an intimidating experience. So how are we, as people who have been in the media industry a bit longer, how are we sensitive to this and aware of this? Now, for example, I lead editorial meetings and I do it with a lovely team, and I'm very fine with that. But I found that extremely, extremely challenging at the beginning of my career. I have a distinct memory of being an apprentice and having an idea that I really wanted to share, but being so nervous about doing it and then mustering up the courage to say my idea. But I think the nerves still got the better of me, because it must have come out as a whisper and absolutely no one heard it except one journalist who told me to try again. And that was a very small thing, but it meant a lot to me. To get around this fear or anxiety that I had, I would email pitches, or I would use trusted and kind colleagues as sounding boards before pitching and suggesting ideas in meetings. Are there any younger or less experienced journalists that you can be the same listening ear to? Because it really doesn't take a lot to make someone feel at ease and to know that there is a support there. It can be as small as telling someone to try again if you're the only one who's heard their idea. I can also think of an example where someone took over a fellow apprentice's desk, and the team leader or the editorial lead of that team made it publicly very clear that that was unacceptable. Do young journalists in your newsroom feel that they have a backer or an advocate in you? that is especially and particularly important if you're in a position of authority. I can also remember an example where we were discussing an idea we had quite passionately, a group of us as journalists, and someone else was kind of like, oh, like they are just so loud and so out of place. And then another journalist just saying, well, that's exactly what they're here to do. So it's just little things like that, so that you don't ask people to come in and change and alter to fit your environment. How can you appreciate the differences that they bring into your environment? As an apprentice, when people did not know what to do with me, I would come up with my own concepts and ideas to show the rest of the team. If you know your team is busy and doesn't have the time or the luxury of time to explain everything as you're doing it on a given and specific day, one really easy practical thing you can do is set a journalist a new task that they can work on independently and report back to you on later. What's something, for example, that you have wanted to do differently for some time and have considered getting a fresh pair of eyes on? Give that journalist time to consider it independently and seriously consider their perspective, even if it's not what you're expecting. Being able to make contributions like this early on in your career can really help in warding off imposter syndrome. And that brings me to the next part of my talk. I think I'm okay for time. I might be a little bit under, so apologies if I am, which is the importance of mutually respectful exchange between older and younger journalists, really, but between journalists in general. So as I briefly alluded to, I joined this industry really as a teenager, at a time when some traditional or more established journalists, I think it's still something that we're going through, but we're getting to grips with the differences that have occurred in our industry with the rise of online. And as a result, I was able to do some really cool things in terms of innovating and digital strategy, like attend meetings at YouTube and look at Newsnight's YouTube strategy, or use Instagram for the first time on BBC Politics Live, or live stream on Periscope for Radio 4. And on some occasions, these initiatives went really well when I was asked to write guides on how to do them for other staff. But it's only really in retrospect that I see these things as innovative or anything special. And on the flip side, I also benefited from seeing so many more experienced journalists work across a range of teams. I benefited immensely from their mentorship, and I learned so much from their experience. Each one of my journalistic achievements, whether I mentioned it here or I did not, are the products of working relationships, because as humans, and I believe this very strongly, we very rarely do or achieve anything in isolation. I think that a lot of time and energy is wasted in our industry because we cannot recognize the value in difference. So for example, some more traditional media outlets will be very snobby or very dismissive of the work that newer media organizations do, or smaller media organizations do. And I think the same is true for some newer media organizations who can sometimes be dismissive of traditional media outlets that have served audiences for generations. But in what ways could both parties and both sides be enriched by seeing the merit, the skill, and the competence in what the other does? How can the type of journalism we do improve when we see the merit in a range of approaches from perspectives that are completely different to our own? How do we develop relationships, working relationships in our newsrooms that are strong enough to withstand these differences without assuming the inherent superiority of one over the other? And that's really the final part of my talk. I'm just going to recap what I went over quickly. I spoke a bit about myself. I spoke a bit about why I think it's important to have young journalists in our newsroom, and why it's important really to just have diverse groups and journalists in our newsrooms. I spoke about how we can get the best out of young journalists, or journalists really who are coming into your newsroom from a different perspective or background, because a young journalist can be an older journalist who's changed careers. And I spoke about the importance of cultivating relationships that enable us to recognize difference, so that ultimately our journalism and our media is enriched as a result. So that's pretty much the end of my talk, and I'd like to thank you again all for the invite, and I hope that you found at least parts of it illuminating.
And thank you so much. That was really funny talk, open, insightful, and incredibly informative and thoughtful. So thank you. If you have questions, do type them into the chat box as we go along. I'm going to start. You mentioned Black Ballad, and I think you're absolutely right that a lot of journalists felt and do feel that the only way to have a voice is to create their own outlet. Now, the Black Ballad has now teamed up with the Financial Times to work on a project on financial literacy. What do you think of this? The idea of legacy houses kind of taking these newer outlets as a bolt-on. Do you think it's a good thing, or do you think it's slightly problematic and it should be more integrated?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Toby Uradine, and she's like fantastic at what she does. And I think as long as it's done in a respectful way, and the relationship is respectful, I think it's a great thing, because I think both parties are enriched by that. They reach different audiences that they might not have otherwise reached. They have different kind of resources that they can share due to the nature of the different media organizations. So I think it's a good thing. And I think you can see when it's done in a I don't want to say organic way, but I think you can see when it's done in a way where both parties feel comfortable and can really fly with that. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, and I think it's something that I would like to see more of, I think.
Thank you. And you mentioned intersectionality in the context of youth, and I think this is absolutely key, and an area where a lot of media organizations are either getting it wrong or getting into trouble, running into culture wars without really understanding what they're wading into. Could you expand on this a little bit about what you mean? You talked about the fact that you come from a kind of place of intersectionality, and you also feel that this isn't kind of reflected in newsrooms and the way newsrooms operate.
So I mean, in case anyone wasn't aware, I'm Black. I'm joking, of course, and obviously I'm quite young, and I'm a woman, and I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but just existing in our industry as a Black journalist puts me in a minority straight away. I think if you look at the retention of Black journalists like myself in a lot of media organizations, the figures unfortunately are not great, and they don't paint a promising or a great picture. Did you want to repeat the question? Sorry, I want to make sure I answer and don't like.
I suppose what I'm saying is, do you think that a younger generation of journalists are defining themselves by different categories from older journalists?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think there was a lot of talk that went on about maybe like queer journalists don't just want to be commissioned to write about queer stories or queer things, and I think it's very dependent, because some journalists are very happy to define themselves by their identity and really lean into that niche and cover stories on that beat, and some journalists don't want to do that. And I think that there should be space in our industry for both. So for example, we had like a Bold Black British Future series that we did at the Voice newspaper, and it was important to me that the group I commissioned were representative, but also that those groups didn't feel pressured to write on their specific intersectional lens, such as maybe being from the LGBTQI+ community. So yeah, I think it can be hard for journalists. Our generation does, I think, define itself by our identity a lot more, and it can be hard. I think every journalist breaking into the industry is like, do I just want to write about Black stories? Do I just want to write about the working class experience? And I think the answer is really that the industry has to give them the space to do both.
Absolutely. And you, related to that, you mentioned impartiality, and I think you're absolutely right that the concept of impartiality is not impartial in the way it's implemented in newsrooms. You talked about the fact that it does not offer equal protection to everybody. Can you give me examples of what you mean there?
So I mean, I won't get into detail, but there are specific stories that I've wanted to cover that I have known that need more of a legal fine tooth looked over, because certain people are very proactive in suing for defamation, because that's something that they have the resources to do. And so for people who take issue with those people, or do not share their view, or feel victimized by those people who have less resources, as journalists, are we able to serve those communities as well as we would like to in light of current laws? And so that's really what I was alluding to.
Thank you. I'm going to go into the chat questions from Jill Lupupa. Says, how did you get into the BBC by the digital trainee scheme? But how did you apply? And how did you break into journalism generally? She says she's trying to do the same as work with Black Ballad too.
Okay. Oh, brilliant that you've worked with Black Ballad as well. So the way I got, it's funny because when I started writing for Black Ballad, Toby, who's in charge of it, always said to me, you'll work here until you'll get your big BBC job. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know how that's going to happen. when this scheme emerged, they kind of told me about that scheme, and so I applied, and it was a fairly normal application process online, but we had to do stuff like produce video for it, or like talk about how we would cover certain stories, and then there was an interview process where we had to act as if it was a big thing that we were coming up to cover. But I'm just aware that like applying for things is such an arduous process, and I think so much advice goes around it, but I think the key thing that I would say is just persistency. You just have to keep applying and try not to take rejections personally. But yeah, I can't say there's like a specific magic formula. I could say, for example, like just try and be yourself during an interview process, but maybe for some people that won't work. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, and good luck, Jill. Let me just pass it over to Rebecca in the room. Just very carefully so I don't tangle up the wires. There you go.
Hi, Izin.
Hi.
I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry, I work for the BBC, I should say. Because retention, I think, is a real issue in that we get people in a very laudable way on development schemes or training schemes. And I came into training many years ago, but I do see how there is this kind of maybe if you don't then kind of mold yourself into the cookie cutter of what perhaps a BBC journalist might be, people feel sort of uncomfortable and perhaps do move on. What do you think are some of the things that the organisation and other organisations like it could do to retain journalists who do bring that kind of diversity and all of its kind of richness?
I think that's such a good question, and it's very hard to give like a short answer to, or a snappy answer to. I think the place to start with is, as I said briefly, like our newsrooms and our workplaces are not insulated from some of the wider prejudices that exist in society, and so whether unconsciously or consciously, colleagues can reproduce some of those ways in ways that is undermining or gaslighting towards diverse colleagues from various walks of life and from different walks of life. I think a good place to start is to really speak to colleagues from diverse backgrounds about their experiences in the newsroom, and be prepared to hear things that you might not agree with and not like, but if you speak to, I think, a lot of diverse colleagues that have managed to exist at a range of media organizations, they will talk of certain experiences that made them consider leaving. And so in speaking to them and working out what those experiences are, I think that's perhaps the place to start, I think. But yeah, it's a difficult one, right? Because our workplaces are not insulated from things in society. And so I don't know what changes first or where it changes first.
Do you think it helps just to sort of have a buddy or a mentor or something like that to kind of, that is kind of more embedded in the organisation, that can kind of offer assistance, help you out, that sort of thing?
I think people talk a lot about the importance of career sponsors and mentors, and I personally can think of so many people at the BBC who have been incredible for me in that respect, whether that's Kate Forbes, Jackie Martins, Natalie Molina-Rich, and the list goes on. So having those people who you can speak to, who you can tell really champion your work, are really crucial. And I think I've had some formal schemes, and it's due to no fault of people, but people are incredibly busy. So yeah, having those as formal schemes, I think, is a really, really great idea and can be really helpful to journalists who are different, and maybe even partnering them up with journalists who at one point felt they were different, and that can be for a range of reasons. Like, so when you speak to people, it might be because they felt like they came from a certain background, or they had tattoos, or because they will be sensitive to things in ways that perhaps other journalists weren't. You could get a circumstance where someone very well-meaning becomes a mentor, and then they say, well, this happened, and they kind of gaslight their mentee unintentionally. But yeah, I think mentoring is a really, really good positive step, and career sponsors are also vitally important.
Thank you. Kathy.
Yes, hi, thank you, Izin. Hi, my name is Kathy. I'm a Canadian journalist. Some of the things you're talking about seem to me to be very difficult conversations that need to be had in newsrooms. From what I can tell, in Britain, US, Canada, were you able to have these conversations when you were working within the BBC? Would people listen to you, or are these conversations that you can only have now that you are not within the BBC environment?
That's such an interesting question. I think first of all, for the purposes of that question, I don't think it's helpful to focus on a specific media organization, because I think the media industry as a whole, most of the people that will recognize that we have problems with diversity recognize that it's a problem across the board. I read a really interesting article about how in the wake of Black Lives Matter, a lot of organizations, companies, and this is not just media organizations, kind of tasked their Black employees with all this diversity work that was unpaid, to have these kind of discussions and difficult discussions, and do these things. I think the thing about it is, and I think I've learned this a lot in terms of how I try, and I don't always succeed, but to be an ally to other groups, whether that be people who are disabled or people who are not straight. And it's always easier for me as a person who is straight to say, well, this is like homophobic, or as a person who is able to say, well, this is ableist. So it is, for journalists that exist at whatever margin, it is very difficult to have those conversations and stick your head above the parapet. And it's much easier if people are willing to say important things for you. Yeah, and it might not necessarily be because individuals are horrible or mean, but there are certain things that will be said that will just, by the nature of what is being said, make people uncomfortable, because it will force them to consider how unknowingly, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps with the best of intentions, they have made others uncomfortable. So yeah, it's difficult to have those conversations. That's all I can say about that.
Just to be clear, I wasn't singling out BBC. I was using it sort of to stand in for all the mainstream legacy news organizations that need to have these difficult conversations and could benefit from your advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, Zin.
Ramisha.
My name is Ramisha, and I work for the Urdu service of the Independent UK, and I'm from Pakistan. And I have two questions for you, and I don't need to be really long, but my first question is that, I mean, we are still in many parts of the world struggling with the fact that people discriminate us for being a woman, and then if you are a woman journalist and you are being discriminated for your color as well, that is the last thing you want. And I mean, you don't want it at all, not the last thing. So my first question is, if somebody faces discrimination because of their color, how should they deal with it? I mean, if they face it in the newsroom, how should they deal with it? That's the first question. The second question is that I myself believe that young journalists should be given space in news organizations, because sometimes you do not need to do one thing over and over again for 10 years to get that thing. I mean, to get it right, to get it perfectly. The environment which I come from, the journalism environment in Pakistan, they prefer journalists with many years of experience over a qualified journalist who's young and talented. And I've seen this differentiation in many places and in many news organizations, and I've worked at 3 news organizations so far. So if you're young, if you're talented, should you be given preference over a journalist who has many years of experience and does lack some of the things which, I mean, you own as a young journalist? What do you say about it?
I think those are two really interesting questions. So the first one, in terms of how should you respond to discrimination in the workplace, I think is such a difficult one. Very recently, I was asked to write for my union about some of these issues, and I feel very uncomfortable even now saying certain things. I think the best thing, the first practical piece of advice, right? Because I could say here, like, it's better to just like say to your superior, and most superiors are smart enough to be able to say, like, if there's anything that is awry, please feel comfortable and tell me, and they do mean it. Absolutely. But I think the first advice that I would give to journalists who are marginalized is find communities of journalists who are marginalized like yourself, because it helps you withstand some of those difficulties that you can all inherently understand. And if you do feel comfortable enough, or if you do feel like there are trusted colleagues that you can report certain things to, then that's absolutely something that you should do. However, I don't feel confident to say that there is no consequence or thing that happens as a result of that. I don't know. I've not done that, so I won't be able to say that. So just because I would like to protect marginalized journalists, the first practical piece of advice I would say is find journalists like you who understand the things that you are facing, and so that you can, in community with each other, discuss how to navigate those things. Because I think it also depends on workplaces. Some workplaces will be really good at nipping something like that in the bud and understanding it and making sure everyone feels comfortable, and other places won't. So I wouldn't give like one blanket piece of advice for journalists who are dealing with discrimination. And in terms of the second thing, in terms of a preference should be given over certain journalists, I guess it's difficult if you're in a recruiting position and you have to choose one journalist or the other. But I really am very, very firm on it's like not young journalists to the detriment or to the preference to over like more established and more experienced journalists. It really is that when we get opportunities to work together in community, in mutually respectful relationships, that our journalists can be improved and flourish. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it is. If it's a specific problem in your country where young journalists are not being given chances and opportunities, that is a shame, because they can bring certain perspectives that could invigorate and improve the journalism of the place. But I don't know if I would comment on like specifically choosing one journalist over the other, because I really am big in how we can look better at an industry at recognizing and appreciating different forms of knowledge, experience, and enriching and making our journalism better as a result.
Thank you so much, Izin.
Thank you so much for your questions. They were really, really good.
Thank you. And one here from
Hey, Izin, it's Kate. I wanted to ask you a little bit. You touched briefly on social media, and I wondered. Sometimes you look at young people coming up through the industry and some of the things that they do on social media, and it gives you a little bit of pause. And I wondered if you had picked up any lessons along the way that you would want to pass on to a younger you or younger people coming into the industry.
When you say things that give you pause, what do you mean? Is it hard to do without getting too specific?
Yes. Let's say that sometimes there can be a sort of over personalized oversharing.
I think that's such an interesting question, and I think it's something that every single young journalist grapples with, because the truth of the matter is that there are, and we haven't been, I don't think we've had journalists with personal social media profiles to know the long-term effects of this. But in terms of being hyper visible and super available and super open, some young journalists do reap material benefits from that. And so, yeah, you do consider, it's definitely something that I consider as I navigate my career. But I can definitely see examples of journalists who have been hyper visible and hyper available, and the material benefits of that in terms of, I don't know, book deals or even roles or jobs. Or I've spoken with industry people who have been like, this person is not necessarily qualified, but they had a really big following, and so they were hired, but they couldn't necessarily do the role. So I think it's really, yeah, because I do see things, I think it's something that we all debate in terms of our online lives. How much is too much to share? How much should be shared? How honest and frank should we be?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have even said young journalists, because it's not just young journalists. There's some very old journalists who seem to fall into a sort of a trap of like always having to say something, so they're always getting some attention.
Yes, exactly. And I think, yeah, I think the thing is, when you look at I'm not an expert on this, but if you look at the incentives on these places, it is to be like controversial, to be difficult, not to be controversial, but to make people, whether you make them really happy or really angry. So I think some of us are like unknowingly like fueling fires that are unnecessary. But yeah, I think it's a difficult thing that every journalist kind of has to think of and navigate for themselves. But you're absolutely right, it is tricky, and I do wonder what the long-term impacts are. And the only other thing I would say about that is a journalist who I really respect called Megha Mohan at the BBC, and she said very recently, like, please, women of colour journalists, realise that you are held to different standards than other people as you choose what to share online. So yeah, I think it's a really difficult one to tell where the chips will fall and to advise on. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to take the floor back again because I've got some questions about the voice. Actually, you've been there two months. I'm really interested to know what got you the job? What was it that you said at the interview, or whatever was that made them hire you? And crucially, I think you've been there 10 weeks and there's been a 20% increase in new users. So what have you done? What have you done to get them?
In terms of what we have done, I think SEO, like improving some of our SEO practices. Our Bold Black British Future series was specifically looking at how we could target audiences and build brand recognition amongst them. And we're going to continue on looking at more things in detail in terms of strategy. But I also changed our Instagram strategy, and we're in the process of changing our commissioning process. But in terms of the things that we did, it was also looking at more first-person stories and trying to do things more exclusively. So yeah, that's a bit of a range or a mishmash of things that we've done to increase those new users. So that was 20% up that our new users were in my first 4 months at The Voice. And in terms of what I said in my interview, I think that's such an interesting question. Like, this is a role that I definitely applied for like early on this year, and then I only started like later on this year. So I think some of the things that interested them in terms of the interview were my hopes for building brand recognition amongst younger audiences in a way that we really had when the newspaper was founded and started, and some of my experience in doing that with more traditional media and looking how we can like innovate and change to reach different audiences.
Thank you. You mentioned the changes in the commissioning process. What is that? The kind of people you were commissioning, or the kind of stories you were commissioning?
So some of the kind of stories that we are commissioning, also some of the people that we're working with, and looking at how we can give our journalists more time to pursue things that take a bit more time.
Yeah. And how confident are you, or are you confident about the Black Lives Matters movement affecting sustained change, or a real kind of difference in the way people think that outlasts the hashtag popularity?
I think that's such an interesting question. I was speaking recently to Izin Akhabau, who wrote the book Whites, about whether we think that this moment will lead to lasting change across our industry or in our industry. And I hope so, but I don't know. I hope it will lead to lasting change, but I'm just unsure personally.
What could we do as journalists to try and make the change? And should we do anything? Is it our role as journalists?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of just as citizens, as people who exist in community with others, it is, all of us should try and make efforts to consider how to include others. In terms of us as journalists, there will definitely be like people within your newsroom or people within your context who could benefit from just an ally. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't take much. It can take someone encouraging someone to try again. It can take you sticking up for someone. It can take you just having like a coffee with someone to ask like, how are things really going? I think in terms of how we do that as journalists, though, I think it's really looking at how we cover stories and trying not to fall privy to certain ways of seeing things unquestioningly. And I think there is more awareness around some of those things that I have definitely seen evidence of. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Izin. Any other questions from the room? Jenny, yes. Go around this way.
Hi, thank you for the really interesting talk. I'm Jenny and I work for the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper in Finland. And so I wanted to ask about one trend that I've seen in legacy media in Finland and elsewhere too. So I've seen this trend that legacy media have tried to answer to this demand of diversity by, for instance, hiring one young person, one young journalist, one young woman, or doing one magazine cover with a person of color, or something like that. And sometimes I feel like there's this sense of complacency, like now we have done this enormous amazing service or favor to the society. And I know that the debate is kind of divided, that some people say these are media stunts and ways to increase sales, and others see that these are something that should be celebrated. So I wanted to ask what your stance is in this debate.
I'm very wary in general of tokenization. I do think that it's really important, for example, to have things like diverse covers or hire people. It's really hard because I can't say like, oh, it's like not a good thing to have a person from whatever minority on the cover, or it's not a good thing to have this scheme that encourages young people into journalism. I myself, like my career is the result of a scheme like that. However, at the same time, you're right, it's absolutely that thing where it's like, we've done it now. And it's like, that's not necessarily the case. Like if you don't look at your practices and if you have like a person on the cover or you do a scheme, that's great, but you also have to ask, why have we got to the stage where we need this scheme? Like, why did that just not organically happen, that this was diverse or that we had diverse covers? And if that process doesn't happen, and you look at how to ensure that in the next 5 years you won't need another scheme, or like we'll go around in this cycle and it's like, oh gosh, we've had no diverse covers again, and you do it again. If you don't do that process of reflecting to how you got to that point, then the value of those things is limited, I guess, except for to the young person who sees themselves represented on that cover, for whom it can mean a lot. But yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of people thinking that that's the end of the action on that, which can be quite frustrating at times.
Thank you.
I have a question actually, because it occurred to me after listening to another talk on diversity in the media, that I've been in the media a lot longer than you, and I've never had anybody Black or Asian involved in any of my interview panels or selection process, all the places I've worked at. And I was just curious, put aside the voice, which is a different case, but with every other kind of job in journalism you've done, have you been interviewed or selected by someone of color?
So when I think of the apprenticeship, there might have been a diverse person, but I don't recall a diverse person on that interview board. But the person that really championed me, from what I can tell afterwards, was a white person called Tim. So I can't think of many actually interview circumstances where I had lots of people of color on the board, although I have interviewed for a role that was not at The Voice, but this was some time ago, and in that one I had like 2 Black women and a white man, so that was quite a novel experience. But you're right, in general on interview boards we don't have lots of people of color. I know at the BBC that they have like unconscious bias training before being on panels like that for interviews, but yeah, that's also something
should possibly extend to selecting the panels as well as the candidates.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you. A question from the chat room. You talked about the wrong reasons to hire young people, and one of them is that they're going to be SEO experts. But the question here is, do you think journalism is putting itself at risk by leaning so heavily on social media for growth, when Facebook, Instagram regularly show they're pursuing their own interests and profits? And is this an issue when you consider a lot of older leaders sort of dump social media on younger journalists without really understanding how this is going to fundamentally help them grow?
That's really interesting. So for example, like at The Voice, our social media profiles are growing, but the vast percentage of our traffic does not come from social media on our website. And I think it was a previous talk where you spoke to someone and she said quite eloquently about how these platforms have their own interests at heart. And so like afterwards, when you see them do initiatives for journalism, it should be considered critically. yeah, the answer to that is perhaps it may well be. Yeah, we may well be putting ourselves at risk by thinking that those are the only places. I think perhaps what I'm interested in exploring more on social media and platform is really how they can feed into the type of journalism that we do, so that our audience can really feel ownership of what we produce at the end of the day. So I'm interested in the relationship building aspect of it. But yeah, I agree that they're not always the best places for growth. And I think in one of the reports that I read from yourselves, it spoke about how sometimes some of the traffic that comes from that site are not necessarily from social media platforms, are not necessarily people that have a real value for journalism. And so it's like, how much of a favor are we doing ourselves by focusing so heavily on that? Yeah, really interesting question. I can't pretend to know all of the answers, but really
nobody does. If we did, we'd be doing a different job, basically. I asked you earlier about how we could keep, how the Black Lives Matter movements could last and how to make change permanent. And this is a very interesting question from Deepti Yadav, which is there any kind of work that can be done via legislation? Is there some work to be done to ensure adequate human rights legislation is brought into effect, especially before we lose the protections that are currently provided as part of the EU?
I think that's such a good question. So fairly recently we had the European Human Rights Committee report that kind of looked at how Black people's human rights were basically not protected. So how current legislation was failing, and it was due to a lot of reasons, like a lack of adequate representation. There had been like a specific part of the group that was specifically for BAME needs and priorities that was disbanded, and the new iteration just wasn't as good at serving their needs. I just have pause sometimes, because I think the laws that we have on paper are supposed to ensure that a lot of the problems that we encounter in real life do not happen, but they still happen. And I think in those cases, it's sometimes a question of resources. So do people who are legally wronged have the resources to seek redress or get justice? And that's a wider question about resources and, in my opinion, who the law protects. But that's my opinion.
No, it's really, really interesting point. Thank you very much. Caitlin's writing something down. Somebody's going to write about it. No, I'm going to ignore that. Thank you, Izin. This has been incredibly impressive and useful and thought-provoking. We're so glad we invited you. I'm so glad you took the time to speak to us. Just to say, next week to join us, because we're going to carry on this conversation about alternative voices in the media and diverse voices with a conversation with Emily Ramshaw. She's an American journalist who is co-founder of the 19th, which is a really extraordinary non-profit, non-partisan newsroom reporting on gender politics and policy in the United States. It'll be at a different time. Because of the time difference, it'll be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon next Wednesday, so do please join us there. But in the meantime, please join me in saying thank you so much to Izin, with virtual claps and actual claps for your talk today.
Thank you so much to all of you for inviting me here today. It was a really interesting discussion, so I appreciate it.
And we'll keep on having it. Thank you. And best of luck with your role as well. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.